The Roman political system is one of the most confusing political systems in ancient history. Now, most ancient cities had a three-part political system where they had what was called an assembly, a council, and magistrates. The assembly was usually made up of the warriors. So, for instance, the Spartan assembly was made up of all Spartan warriors. And the assembly, generally speaking, got to vote on important issues. Different countries, different city-states ran their affairs slightly differently. So in Sparta, for instance, in Greece, the Spartan assembly could only vote yes or no on issues that were sent to it. No debate, no discussion, just yes or no. While in Athens, the assembly could debate and discuss as much as they wanted, and the assembly got to make all the decisions of the state. There was usually also a council, sometimes called a council of elders. Again, I'll use Sparta and Athens as an example here. In Sparta, the council of elders consisted of Spartan citizens over the age of 60. And in Sparta, the council was kind of the most powerful institution in the Spartan state. They got to decide what laws were sent to the assembly to be voted on. In Athens, they also had a council called the Council of the 500. This council was much less powerful. It was only able to set the agenda for the assembly, and the assembly could always override what the council had to say. And then finally, there were positions called magistrates or city officials, the equivalent today of a mayor or a prosecutor or a sheriff. We would think of these sort of as elected spaces, elected positions of power. In Sparta, they were called ephors. In Athens, they were called archons, but generally speaking, they were not the most powerful elements of the Greek city-states. Now, Rome had a political constitution that was very similar to this, but much more complicated. Rome also had assemblies and a council and a position of magistrates. However, again, theirs is going to be much more complex. There are going to be a number of different assemblies in Rome, for instance. In Rome, there were many different assemblies for many different purposes. The most powerful Roman assembly was called the Centuriate Assembly, or the Assembly of the Centuries. And this was sort of based originally on the structure of the Roman army. It would meet outside the walls of the city in the field of Mars, where the army trained, and citizens would be divided up into what were called centuries. Now, these didn't necessarily have 100 people in them. In fact, some of them were much larger than 100 people. The centuries were broken up by social class. So the more wealth you had, sort of the more important century you were put in. And wealthier citizens, in effect, had more votes because their centuries were much smaller than the centuries of the poorer Roman citizens, and every century received only a single vote. The Centuriate Assembly was used for very few laws. Just some of the most important laws were passed by the Centuriate Assembly, but it was called every year to elect the highest officers, the highest magistrates of Rome. There were other assemblies as well. There was an assembly called the Tribal Assembly, which was broken up into units called tribes, and each tribe was based, roughly speaking, on sort of geographically where your family had originally come from in Italy. And this tribal assembly was kind of the normal assembly for use in Rome. Whenever there was a normal law that needed to be passed, it was sent to the assembly. And again, the assembly had to vote on every law. Nothing could become law without the assembly's decision. But much like in Sparta, the assemblies could only vote yes or no. Now, there also was a council in Rome. It was called the Senate. And again, councils are usually the council of elders, and the word senate literally comes from the Latin word senex, or old man. So the council of elders in Rome was, in fact, the Senate. The Senate was made up of all former office holders. Every time someone was elected for a magistrate position, whether by the Centuriate Assembly or the Tribal Assembly or one of the other assemblies, they immediately became a member of the Senate after their term was over. The Senate sort of was the advisory body of Rome, but it had a lot of unofficial power as well. Even though it couldn't officially make laws, the decisions of the Senate were often treated as law by people of their day. Also, the Senate was in charge of foreign policy, financial affairs, diplomacy, warfare, and the like. There was a whole series of magistrates in Rome as well, and I won't go into all of them. Basically, the most important magistrates in Rome were called the consuls, C-O-N-S-U-L-S, of which there were two elected every year. These consuls were elected by the Centuriate Assembly, and during their year in office, they held more or less absolute power in terms of the ability to lead an army into battle. They had the power of life and death of citizens outside of the state of Rome. They had the power to enforce the laws. There were other magistrates as well. There were magistrates called the praetors, of which there were around 8 at the end of the Roman Republic. These were also elected by the centuriate assembly. The praetors were in charge of running law courts and also serving to run the city and city affairs, and they also sometimes had military roles as well. There were some very important officials called tribunes who were sort of restricted to plebeians. This is one of the unique Roman positions, Roman magistracies, that could only be held by someone of the plebeian caste. The plebeians had sort of agitated and fought for the right to have their own political officials early on in Roman history, and the tribunes were kind of the result of this struggle. There were 10 tribunes elected every year, and they were elected only by plebeians and only of plebeians. These plebeian tribunes had very special powers. They had the ability to block a governmental action. This was called a veto, and this is the origin of the modern veto power that the president of the US has to veto laws when they're passed by Congress. The plebeian tribunes also had the right to interpose themselves between sort of the Roman officials and a citizen who was being persecuted by them. He could just sort of stand there and say that so-and-so was under his protection, and then they would have to leave him alone. Now, again, very complicated system, right? Many assemblies. We talked about 2 of them. There were about 4 more. They also had a senate, right, which made all these sort of consultative decisions and advised the magistrates on how to do their jobs, and also ran foreign policy and diplomacy and financial matters and the like. And the day-to-day government of Rome fell in the hands of about 8 different types of magistrates, of which we only talked about 3. So as you can see, this is a very complicated system, but it was also a very successful system. The Roman Republic, which is what the system is called, was founded in 509 BC, and it survived intact until sort of the days of Julius Caesar, around 40 BC. And even after the Roman Republic ended, the early Roman Empire maintained many of these positions, and in fact the Roman Senate continued to meet long after it had lost its power and its normal role in government. And so, just because it's complicated, don't think that Roman governmental procedures aren't important.